this is Issues of Aging and Disability for Trans Jews. So this is a little bit of information about me. I'm not going to read it to you. You can all read it here on the screen. Got information about myself along with my websites and social media information. And I always make my slides available, and the slides are available at workshops.rabbah.rona.us if you want to download them. So right now, we are going to do a quick poll, and the tech is going to put the poll up. And what I'd like to ask people to do, and this is an anonymous poll, is identify 5 categories that you may belong to. Those are if you are trans, an elder, if you have physical challenges, emotional challenges, and developmental challenges. So our tech admin, Noah, is putting them up now.
How is elder defined?
Rabbah Rona, would you be able to explain a little more about how you define elder?
I'm just letting people self-define. You know, the AARP defines it as 50. Medicare is 65. I'm not going to be hard and fast, but if you consider yourself an elder in the community, you know, you're an elder in the community. I don't think there needs to be a hard and fast rule on that. And I will tell everybody that I fall in all 5 categories. I am a trans elder with physical, emotional, and developmental challenges. So I guess I would assume everybody can see the screen, but if not, I'll read off the results. 78% in the room are trans, 25% are elders, 2/3 have physical challenges, 69% have emotional, and surprising to me, only 38% in the room are claiming developmental challenges. And I actually expected that number to be much higher, which we'll talk about later. Thank you. For those who aren't familiar with the term genderpunk, it's actually both a new term and an old term. If you were to look into the New York Public Library's book Stonewall Reader, you would find the term genderfuck used, and that is a term synonymous with genderpunk. It's a term about breaking gender boundaries and gender norms, and that's part of my work, and that's why I use Z here pronouns. So this graphic is kind of a simplified view of my intersectional identities. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of different things in this picture because all of us have very complex identities. I will point out in this lower left-hand corner, lesbi pan, when we are non-binary, sexuality gets very complicated. And in fact, later this year, I will have an article coming out in the Journal of Lesbian Studies talking about gender identity and sexuality, starting with Genesis chapter 1, showing that sex and gender have never been binary, contrary to what most people across the board in Western society believe, and therefore discussing how we have to reframe language surrounding sexuality. We're not sure exactly when this article is going to run, but sometime probably late summer. So, as you can see, it gets pretty complicated, especially when you've been on the planet for a couple of minutes. So, the first topic we're going to talk about is aging. And we saw that about a quarter of the people here self-identify as elders. Some of you probably know Jude Patton. I've known him for a number of years, and he literally wrote the book on trans aging. I say this because he has 2 volumes of the book out now, an anthology on trans aging. Volumes 1 and 2 have been released by Transgender Publishing, with volumes 3 and 4 coming out later this year. And I have an article in volume 2, by the way, talking about issues surrounding Jewish trans aging, which gets very complicated. By the way, I will point out that if you have questions along the way, please use the digital hand, and Rabbi Marissa will be watching out for that and will flag you to go ahead and ask your questions. So I have a series of articles posted on jewishsacredaging.com, which talk about some of the issues surrounding trans care. I think that when trans people end up in care facilities is one of the biggest issues that trans people are going to face. Why is this? Because, like it or not, our bodies are different. Even if we have had all of the surgery that we need to be quote unquote cisnormative, our bodies still may be different. So I'm very open about myself, for instance. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I had vulvoplasty, but not vaginoplasty. So if I needed catheterization, they would see that I looked different when they had to put a catheter in me. Because of my military injuries, I have a lot of neurological damage, and I don't respond to endorphins, which makes electrolysis extremely painful for me. So I've not been able to complete electrolysis. So if I were in a care facility, I would have to have a compassionate caregiver shave me every day. So I wouldn't develop a beard while I'm in the facility. And the caregivers would have to be trained properly to not mock me for being a woman in the facility with a beard. When we're dealing with trans men, even if they were able to get a phalloplasty, they wouldn't look like a cisnormative man. And how many trans men are actually able to access full phallos? Very few, less than 10%, because of the high cost, because of the limited success in technology, and other reasons. Even if they get a MET, it's not normative looking, and most trans men still have their front hole. Then we get into the cases of pre-op and non-op trans people, non-binary people, etc. I mean, the possibilities of how somebody's body looks in any case are endless. And so it becomes incumbent on the trans person, if they're able to communicate, but if they have dementia, they may not be able to. So then the trans person really needs to have a loving advocate who can train their caregivers in the care facility to understand what that trans person really needs so that they have compassionate and correct care while they're in the facility. And even then, because I can tell you, when I was in the hospital after my GCS, in a ward specifically dedicated to trans care, I was misgendered by float nurses. Lee, I see you with a shocked look on your face. Would you like to comment? Okay. Yeah, so it was pretty appalling, but yeah, even in places that are dedicated to trans care, it goes down. So how about a generalized nursing home somewhere that doesn't know from a trans person? You know, it's going to be pretty ugly. And, you know, if you end up on a Medicaid plan somewhere with lowest bidder and, you know, below minimum wage caregivers, you know, who are often immigrants that don't speak English and don't understand. And it's been my experience that immigrant caregivers misgender people more than American workers do for whatever reason. Particularly, and I hate to sound like I'm stereotyping or singling people out, but it's particularly difficult with Asian caregivers. There's cultural differences, and East Asian caregivers are particularly bad at misgendering people, unfortunately. So this is something that you have to be very aware of. You know, I'm sorry if this sounds prejudicial or whatever, but this is just anecdotally what I have experienced in many, many settings. And it's something that you have to be aware of, particularly if you are moving towards ending up in a care facility. So just something to be aware of. If you're heading towards any kind of a surgery of any kind, you have to be aware of it. At the same time, I urge everybody, every single trans person, even if you're 5 years old, you should have an advance directive and a durable power of attorney and a will. Okay? If you don't, contact an estate attorney and get one done up. Why? How many of us have been divorced from our birth families because we have families who would rather see us dead than queer? I see Bilo nodding their head. So many queer families, queer people are, you know, disconnected from their birth families, and if they don't have a partner, you know, they need somebody designated as their decision maker and their caregiver. God forbid they end up in a hospital. I mean, you could get hit by a truck today. And if you don't have that durable power of attorney and advance directive and a POLST, Physician's Orders for Life-Saving Therapy, which tells the paramedics what to do if you pass out in your bed, you know, they could render care that you don't want to have happen. And so it's critical that everybody have those documents prepared. You know, your will can specify how you want your remains handled. You know, the last link on this page is the Chevra Kadisha document prepared by the Boston Chevra Kadisha for trans Jews. And this is a very thorough document. I have talked about in some places, including Jude's book, priorities for how we do Tahora for trans Jews. And they base their priorities on traditional halacha. Traditional halacha says that men can do Tahora on men, women can do tahora on women and men. Why? Because men tend to approach things with kalot rosh. They don't take things seriously, and they wouldn't treat a woman niftara, the body of a woman who had passed away, with proper respect. And so, but they believe in traditional halacha that a woman would treat a man's body with the proper respect. And that's the basis for how the hierarchy of care is given in the Chevra Kadisha for who should do tahara in the case of trans people. And trans people are obviously at the top of the list. And, like does like. If you're a trans woman, you want a trans woman doing your tahara. Trans man, fem non-binary, fem non-binary. If you can find enough people in the community to do that. Obviously, right now during the pandemic, nobody's doing taharot because of the pandemic. Public health transcends halacha because of pikuach nefesh, life-saving, which transcends halacha in every case, except for a few which we don't need to get into right now. And so all bodies are hermetically sealed, and then they're put into the tachrichin. But we're not doing the full tahara on people, unfortunately. And the tachrichin are just set on top of the body. They're not actually enshrouded. So it's a very challenging time for us. But I recommend that everybody take a look at these links and read through them if you have questions. So right now I'm going to open up the floor for questions about elder care and issues surrounding trans aging, because I'm sure that some of the elders and maybe even some of the younger people may have questions about aging. And, geriatric care in general is difficult, but when you're dealing with trans aging, it gets even more complicated. We want to stay on our hormones as long as we can, particularly if you're like me and you started transitioning at 55. As a general rule, they say you want to stay on hormones for 20 to 25 years. So that would put me at 80. But in general, gerontologists say they want you off hormones because they're concerned about risks of blood clots and cancer and heart attacks and everything else. So it becomes a big battle. Plus, I know from personal experience that stopping hormones puts me in a rage and in a really bad mood and puts me in extreme pain. And so I dread the day that they take my hormones away from me. So yeah, there's all kinds of issues surrounding trans elder care that we have to be concerned with. So questions, please. Okay.
Oh, you can a reminder that you can ask a question either by putting it in the chat or by raising your hand electronically. I see a question from Hannah Stern.
Go ahead.
Yes, hi. My question is about how the intersection works if you're observant Jewish and at the same trans and might eventually need to access elder care, be it in an institution, be it outpatient, like additional issues would include kosher nutrition and things.
Forgive me, my hearing is really bad and I could not understand the question. Could I get one of the techs to repeat the question for me?
Hannah, I apologize. I also did not hear the question. Would you be able to repeat it a little more slowly?
Or else type it into the chat, please.
Okay, Hannah is typing it. And while that's happening, there's a question in the chat. Do you have knowledge of life for trans people in long-term care facilities who feel it necessary to go back in the closet?
I haven't heard about that personally. That's something I would have to ask Jude about. I'm sure that he has dealt with it, and it may be written about in his book. I can send him a message right now and see if he responds while we're in the session.
All right, and Hannah's question is about the intersection of being observant and observantly Jewish and trans. And if you have any insight on that.
Okay, so the intersection of being Orthodox or observant and trans is very difficult. And there's a workshop later today being led by Dana Friedman and one other person dealing with that. There are, of course, Jewish care homes, such as Klein-Galland in Seattle, the Riverdale home, a number of homes in Brooklyn, and I'm sure in Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago. Those are ones that I know of. They may not be very experienced with trans people, though, and so it would take a lot of education to teach them how to deal with trans people. I am a member of the New York Board of Rabbis, and one of the leaders of the New York Board of Rabbis is an Orthodox rabbi named Craig Miller, and he was one of my teachers, and he's a big trans ally. And of course, he has read my book and is a big believer in my book. And, so if you were to be needing to be placed in a facility in the New York area, you could reach out to me and I could reach out to Rabbi Miller and he could advocate for you on your behalf with the rabbis at that facility to make sure that you are receiving proper care in terms of kavod habriut at the facility, that they didn't discriminate against you because of being trans. It is important to remember that we are all created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, that in Bereshit chapter 1, verse 27, it says that God created the Adam b'tselem, God created the Adam. And when that doubling is there, that means absolute emphasis. And remember that God is incorporeal and infinite. God does not have a body. The Torah talks about physical characteristics of God to help us have some understanding. So here we're talking about assigned sex, which means that if we were to imagine that God might have assigned sex, God would have infinite possibility. Now I'm going to take the slides down for a minute and put up a different view for a second. Give me just a second here. So we can see what I want to show you. I'm going to show you our pasuk so you can visually see this. Okay, so you can see the verse here. And if you look at Zacharu Nekeva, male and female, some of you may be Torah readers, and so you know the cantillation marks, but I'll point out that under Zachar you have a mercha, under Nekeva you have a tipcha, the little curves here. This shows that these are a single text block. This is what the Masoret text tells us. Zachar and Nekeva goes together as a single block. This is not a binary state. This is one block of identity. The Adam, which is metaphor for humanity, was both male and female. In other words, every possible assigned sex. Further, if we do literary poetic analysis, male and female is a merism. If we consider, for instance, Vayera Vayiboker, it was evening and it was morning. That's talking about a day, but it just says evening and morning. It doesn't say noon or afternoon or twilight or any of those other times of the day. It just gives two parts of the time of the day, which are framing to give the entire part. That's the same kind of thing.
Rabbi,
That's what merism means.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. We can't see what you're describing. I'm so sorry.
Okay, let me start over again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry.
No problem. I thought you could. Can you see it now?
You're showing Safaria? Yes.
Okay, we're showing Safaria, yeah. Okay, so I'll go back to Genesis 27. So Zachar and Nekeva, you can see the cantillation marks, which show that that's a single block of text. And then if we go back to a creation note, Vayera Vayiboker, it was evening, it was morning. So that is called a merism, which is two parts of the whole that frame the entire whole and show us that the whole exists because of the two parts. And the same is true in our verse here, where male and female represents the totality of possible assigned sex. So in three different ways, with the doubling of B'Tselem, with the cantillation mark, and with the understanding of the literary analysis of merism, we see that there is infinite possibility of assigned sex here. And then if we go to the Midrash, we can go to Bereshit Rabbah 8:1. And I'll go to the English here so it's easier to see. Said Rabbi Yirmiyahu ben Elazar, when the Holy Blessing One created the first Adam, God created them androgynos, as it is said, male and female, God created them. And please keep in mind that in the rabbinic mind, androgynos means someone with indeterminate genitalia, not male or female. And we also have an interesting midrash in Mishnah Sanhedrin 5:1. And let me bring that up to show you. Or 5:4, excuse me, sorry. Or was it 4:5? I think it was 4:5. Sorry. Here we go. And to tell the greatness of the Holy Blessing One, when a person stamps coins with one seal, they're all similar, but when the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy Blessing One, stamped all people with the seal of Adam Harishon, not one of them is similar to another. So this tells us, you know, the Torah text and then the Mishnah and the Midrash are all telling us that from Torah and rabbinic tradition, that we know that we are not corrupting creation or rabbinic tradition when we are living our fulfilled lives as we were created by Hashem. Further, there are 3 biblical commandments as trans women, or 1 as trans men, that we have to transcend, and those are cross-dressing, shaving our beard, and removing the male genitals. And I can give you a brief synopsis of those. Cross-dressing, the prohibitions are based on avodah zarah, which is idolatry, and for sexual licentiousness. Clearly, when we are transitioning, we're doing neither. The castration applies to men only. If we are a trans woman, we are not men, first of all. And secondly, it applies to cases of avodah zarah. It's well documented that Kadeshim were often castrated, and this is one of those practices that's prohibited by the beginning of chapter 18 of Vayikra. Removing the beard is in the same section as gashing of the forehead, a ritual done in grief in the ancient world, and actually still done in Shia Islam in Iran in modern times. And so again, we're not doing this in grief. We are not doing this in avodah zarah. We're doing this to live. And so in all of these cases, we are clear of the halachic violations because we are not violating what the Torah prohibits, because we are not doing what the Egyptians and the Canaanites did when we do these acts. And so that all is detailed in my book and in other books that people have written about trans identity.
Rabbah Rona, we have two more
your question?
We have 2 more questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first is, how can the Jewish community and Jewish leaders support folks in our spaces who are dealing with issues around elder care and the intersection of being Jewish and trans?
Well, the first step is to educate them on trans identity clearly. And this is true not just for elder care, but for disability care in the trans community or broader in the Jewish community. You know, and this gets into my slides on disability, but, you know, you come to so many communities and they pat themselves on the back if they have a ramp up to the Amud. And they say, look what we've done. We put a ramp to the Amud. We are accessible. And they may even say, if you're able, please stand for the Amidah. But do they have accessible Sidurim for people like me that can't hold a liberal Sidur because it's too heavy? No. Do they have accessible Sidurim for people with reduced eyesight? No. Do they have ASL interpreters or captioning? Of course not. Do they have food set out for people who are diabetics and have the risk of low blood sugar? No, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do they have cutouts for people who use wheels? Of course not. And on go the list. There are very, very few shuls in the Jewish community. Here in Las Vegas, the Federation didn't even know about Disability Awareness Month, let alone do anything for Disability Awareness Month in the community. I mean, this is how bad things are. So it becomes incumbent on the communal leaders in the trans community to educate the broader community. And then also for the LGBT leaders outside of the trans community to be strong advocates for us. And that becomes problematic when we have so many TERF rabbis. And I'm sorry to say that, but that is true, particularly in the Reform movement. There is a huge contingent of TERF rabbis, and it is a huge problem. The leadership of the Reform movement is flooded with TERF rabbis. And so while the RAC may be very good at some of these issues, the CCAR is not. And whereas, individual rabbis may be, but as an organization, the CCAR is awful at it. And so it becomes very challenging. So we have to work much harder to do the advocacy.
So the next question actually lines up perfectly with that. What would you say are some essential ways to advocate for LGBTQ plus elders and disabled LGBTQ plus folks who are maybe undergoing medical treatment?
Well, I think that, for instance, the work that Jude is doing with his books is vital. Having those books available for, okay, we're looking at Jewish religious orgs. What are Jewish religious orgs doing? There aren't very many Jewish religious orgs that are focusing on elder care. Keshet and other orgs are focused mainly on queer youth. And I'm not terribly aware of anybody who's focusing on queer elders in the Jewish community. And the question is, who is good? There are specific queer organizations that are great. Keshet, JQ International, the LGBT Jewish specific organizations are good. There are specific synagogues out there, obviously, like CBST, Beit Chaim Chadashim, ASL, thank you, Hannah. Yes, obviously, there are specific organizations doing good work, but as a whole, there's a lot of growth that needs to be done. I mean, the conservative movement only just started recognizing trans people very recently, and in the seminaries across all except for the Reconstructionist movements, there are students that are still having problems as of right now. It continues. So, I mean, we're getting way afield, and we still haven't gotten to disability stuff yet. So, I mean, this is a huge problem, and these are really important questions that you all are asking. I wish I had answers. I really do. How is Renewal doing? Olive? I have no idea. They're such a small organization. I'm sure that they're great because they are so progressive, but they have such a small footprint, and they do very little. Yeah, Women's Music Festival was horribly transphobic. They were awful. So I'm going to go back to the workshop so we can get through to the disability issues. So as I see it, there are three different categories of disability: physical challenges, emotional behavioral challenges, and developmental challenges. Developmental includes things like neurodivergence, educational issues, and so forth. Most people don't understand that neurodivergence is not a mental health issue and actually lump it in together. But neurodivergence is not an emotional or mental health issue. And so I want to stress that. As we've already talked about this a little bit. So in the Jewish community, in the trans Jewish community, issues are even higher than in the mainstream Jewish community because issues are higher in the trans community than they are in the mainstream community. And that's documented in the National Trans Discrimination Study. Some of you may have heard this before. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. But the NTDS talks about a 9-time higher suicide attempt rate, much higher mental health issues. But I want to stress, this is not to say that trans people are categorically mentally ill. Rather, this is because we are subject to external oppression due to things like lower economic security, housing security, employment security, poor access to health care, which makes physical disabilities worse, etc. So all of these external factors create huge amounts of stress, disability, health, depression, anxiety, etc. And when people have other underlying conditions, obviously it hugely aggravates and exacerbates them. Now, when we get to neurodivergence, which is things like autism, Asperger's, dyslexia, and so forth, there was a study done last summer in the journal Nature, which shows that there is an elevated rate of autism and other neurodivergence in trans people. Now, when I posted this on Facebook, a lot of trans people said, yeah, no kidding, we already knew that. Other people responded, now wait a minute, we don't want this kind of information to be put out there because then the people who are fighting us are going to say, look, those trans people are crazy. We told you so. But again, even though this says psychiatric diagnoses, the fact is that those psychiatric diagnoses are not because trans people are inherently mentally ill, but because of external issues. However, there is a correlation between trans identity and neurodivergence, which comes from who we are, because we are born trans and we are born neurodivergent. Now, when we look at Jewish identity, is there a correlation between trans identity and Jewish identity? Neurodivergence and Jewish identity. And Stanford is actually doing research right now on the incidence of neurodivergence in the Ashkenazi gene pool. We already know that there's a higher incidence of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome in the Ashkenazi community because of various conditions, including waiting longer to have children. So does this impact neurodivergence as well? And of course, we know that certain environmental factors can also affect the incidence of neurodivergence. So, law of intersectionality suggests that since neurodivergence is higher in the trans community and neurodivergence may be higher in the Jewish community, in theory, we would expect a very high likelihood of trans Jews being neurodivergent, which is why I was really surprised that in our cross-section here today, there was only 38% self-reporting neurodivergence. I really expected a much higher number of neurodivergence self-reporting today. So this really surprised me.
Rabbah Rona, I just want to give you a heads up that we are about 5 minutes from the end of our time.
Okay, well, that's all my slides. So now, thank you, Rabbi Marissa. Now we'll just open it up for questions. Hi, Fragel, nice to see you. So I'm seeing a lot of comments. Okay, neurodivergence and developmental disabilities are not considered the same thing. Oh, some people didn't realize that when I was talking developmental, I was talking about neurodivergence. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Trisomy 21 is a neurodivergent issue. Yeah. Sydney notes that there are a lot of other ND conditions. Jess notes neurodivergent people aren't crazy. Exactly, that's my point. Neurodivergence is not a mental health issue at all. Joshua says this kind of research squicks them out a lot. There are so many intersection issues, absolutely. Neurodivergent is a very inclusive term and includes many more developmental disabilities, absolutely. Certain things are commonly considered as mental health or part of neurodiversity, though. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how many people are diagnosed with ADHD that are actually autistic? I mean, I see Bio raising their hand. ADHD is a lazy diagnosis. People diagnose kids as ADHD all the time because they don't want to be bothered with anything and they slap them on Ritalin, when in fact the kids are actually autistic, but they don't want to go through the work of doing the proper assessments and actually working with the kids. So they go the lazy route and slam them on speed, which I think is really gross. So, you know, that's my opinion. I'm not a medical professional, but I am a mental health counselor. And I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of different settings, and this has been, you know, anecdotally what I've seen. So Jack notes that BCC has come a long way in working with the trans community. Live stream Shabbat services every night, every Friday. Yeah. Hannah notes, been rejected from converting by an Aleph alum in Germany because you're trans. Hannah, I note that in a previous workshop, another person talked about being blocked from converting because they're trans in Germany. It's a huge issue, obviously, with the German progressive rabbinic community there. Okay, so we've got about a minute left. Does anybody have any last minute questions or comments before we have to close this out? Okay, so Freigel says that's all neurodivergence from an oppressive norm, whether mental, emotional development. They have experience, Faye has experience in all categories. Reclaim mad crazy the way queer is a reclaimed word. Yeah, ADHD goes undiagnosed as much as overdiagnosed from Jess. You're welcome, everybody. Yeah, it would be awesome if people start getting together and, you know, talking about these things and comparing notes and, you know, getting to know each other, working together, you know, fight the good fight. We've got to, you know, we got to form a union because nobody else is going to fight that union.
Thank you so much, Rabbah Rona. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful ASL interpreters.
I want to thank everybody in the group for some amazing questions and discussion, because this is what I really was banking on. I just put out a few slides because I did not want to be didactic. And I really appreciate that you all got into it. That's what makes a great session, is when you all get into it and, you know, feed us stuff to talk about. So mad props to all of you in the session.
We will see you all in about 10 minutes on our big welcome session. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to shut down this room now.